Alright, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be creating the item container grid that will hold all of the item slots that we created in our previous lecture. And then we're going to add that to our player inventory widget so that we can see all of the item slots. So let's go ahead and get started. So in our inventory widgets, we're going to right click, create a new user interface, widget blueprint, and user widget. So we're going to name this w_item container grid, and go ahead and double click and open this up. And essentially this grid is going to be a separate widget blueprint. That way we can reuse it in things like our hotbar, inventory, and also our storage box. So in our grid here, we want to add just two things: a scroll box. So a scroll box will allow us to place all of our items arranged in a grid, and then we can scroll up or down depending on how many slots you have in that inventory. The next thing we want to add is a grid, or a uniform grid panel. And so you can see this is a panel that evenly divides up available space between all of its children. So basically this is exactly what we need to create an inventory, and it's already built into Unreal Engine. So take this, drag it into here, and I believe we just leave it at that. We can rename this to grid and set this to isVariable. And that's pretty much it for the layout. In the graph, we're going to add a little bit of logic here to generate the slots. So we need to add a couple variables. So in our variables here, we'll add a new variable and name this slots per row, and change this to an integer. Compile, save this, set this to instance editable, and expose on spawn. So this will allow us to set the slots per row when we add it into our inventory widget. Okay, so allow us to set it for this grid, and add another variable. Again, it will be integer, and this will be total slots. Compile, save that, and same thing, set that to instance editable and expose on spawn. And we'll see this in action here in a couple seconds. The next thing that we want to do is we actually have to create a new enumeration. So in our content browser, in the blueprints enums, we want to right click and create a new blueprint enumeration, and we're going to name this e_container type. And so open that up. This is going to be used for the different inventory containers that we have. So, our inventory, hotbar, storage, and then our armor slots or our gear slots. So add for total. So again, we have our player inventory, we have our player hotbar, then we have our player storage, or like the storage container. Then we have player armor. So save that. We can go ahead and close that. So now we add that new variable inside of our container grid here, and change this to that e_container type enumeration that we created, and rename the variable here to container type, and set that to instance editable and expose on spawn. So now what we can do is in our graph here, let's delete the pre-construct and the tick, and we're going to add a function here that will generate the amount of slots that we need for this grid. So create a new function, and we're going to name this function add slots, and click on the function right here so that we can add things like inputs. We're going to add one input, and it's going to be of the type integer, and we can rename this to amount. So we're going to add slots depending on the amount that we specify. And so we're going to take this amount and promote this to a local variable, and we'll rename this variable to local loop index. So we're going to save the amount that we need to add, the amount of slots that we need to add, and we're going to do a loop to add each individual slot. So go ahead and going to use the for loop. So at the very bottom, we're going to use this for loop. And so the first index, we want to change this to 1. So we want to start at 1. And then for our last index, we'll take this local loop index and get it, hook it up for our last index. So we're going to loop however many times or however many slots we need to add. And then for actually adding the slots, what we're going to do is drag off of the loop body and do a create widget. And the widget that we're going to create is our inventory slot, because we want to create an inventory slot per each slot inside of our grid. So for our owning player, what we want to do is right click and type in get owning player and hook that up. And then what we want to do is off this return value, drag off here and do promote to variable and compile and save that. And let's actually delete this one right here, because we're going to just compile, save that. We're going to rename this and change the type. So rename this variable that we just created. And of course, what you could also do is you could either create this variable by searching for W inventory slot, but we're going to right click, rename this. This is going to be our slots, and we're going to change this from a single variable type to an array. So basically, can't parse value for none slots property. Let's compile that again, and that bug should go away. So you should have this array of these W inventory slots, which is just this widget right here, this W inventory slot widget. And then we want to get the slots and drag off here and do a add. So under the array we have this add. And so every time we create a inventory slot, we're going to add it to this array. That way we save a reference to all the different slots. Now we also need to create another function that we're going to use. So go ahead and create another function here, and this is going to be called add slot to grid. And select the function here and add 2 inputs. The first input will be integer, and we'll rename this to index. And the second will be of the type W underscore inventory slot object reference. And then we want to rename this to slot. So we're going to then promote this index here to a local variable and just name this to a local slot index, and then take the slot reference and promote that to a local variable and name this to a local slot. And now what we're doing is we're basically setting the position of the slot that we create. So if you don't know how like the inventory or how the uniform grid works, basically you have a certain amount of slots and you have, rows and columns. So you have to set like the row position depending on how many slots per row that you have. If your inventory has like 6 slots per row, it has a total of 30 slots. It'd basically be a 6 slot by 5 inventory. So now what we can do is in here grab our grid, get grid, and then we're going to drag off here and do a add child to uniform grid. So this will add the actual slot to the grid. So then take this local slot. We will need to move this widget down a little bit and take this local slot and hook this up to the content here. So this is that local slot that we're setting here. And then in row and column, just set that to 0 for now. What we have to do next is just a little math. So just bear with me for now. We have to basically set the row and column based on a few different math nodes. So we're going to get the local slot index, And then we're going to take this and convert this to a float. So type into float integer. And then we want to get these slots per row. And take that and convert that to float integer. So you want to convert an integer to a float. That way you can, divide it, multiply it. So then we can go ahead and do a divide. We're going to divide our local slot index by our slots per row. Then down here we're going to take the local slot index and do a division, whole, and remainder. And for the dividend, we're going to leave that to the local slot index, and for the slots per row, we're going to hook that to the divisor. Then we're going to take this value and truncate. So what a truncate does is it takes any float value and rounds it down to an integer. So it takes, a decimal point number and rounds it to a whole number. Off this add child to uniform grid, we can drag off here and do a set row. And for the row, we can take this integer value in for the row. So this will calculate which row it should be. And then what we want to do is, off of this add child to uniform grid, just double click to add a reroute node here. Just drag off here, we can do a set column. And for the end column, we'll take this remainder and do a truncate. And hook that up to the end column. So we should have something looking like this. So basically what we're doing is, depending on however many slots per row we have, what this is doing is we're going to add a child to that grid, a uniform grid. Then we're setting the row and column based on however many slots per row we have. So now we can use this function inside of our add slots. So off of here, what we can do is call our add slot to grid. And for the index, we can hook up the integer value right here. And for the slot reference, we can take this return value and hook it up to the slot. Okay. So now if we go all the way back to our event graph, outside of the function, in our event construct, we can just call our add slots. So event construct is called basically when this widget is created. So basically that's when the game starts. Then for this amount, we want to drag in our total slots for the amount, and compile, save that, and we are all done creating this item container grid. So I know that was quite a bit. It'll all make sense here in a second. So let's go ahead and add this to our inventory widget now. So go ahead and open up our w_inventory, and then under the user created, we can take our item container grid and drag this inside of our inventory right here. And what it should add it to is inside of this vertical box. So it should be right next to this horizontal box, like so. And then select the item container grid and set that to fill. So we'll fill this entire area right here. And we'll add a padding of 20. Compile, save that. And now what you're going to see with this item container grid selected is in the default values, we can set that slots per row, total slots, and container type. So for the slots per row, we want to set this to 5 slots per row. And the total slots, we want to set this to 30. And leave the container type as player inventory, since this is our player inventory. And the total slots corresponds with however many slots we have in our inventory component. So if you remember, in our main blueprints first person character, we have this inventory component, and under our items we have 30 different slots. So you want to make sure you keep the same exact amount of slots here in this widget. Okay, so now we should be able to see this in action. So if we go ahead and hit play here, we hit tab, you're going to see that we have all of our item slots now. And of course you can see that it's all generated, but we have like this item icon and all the text and all that stuff is visible. So let's go ahead and just make that all hidden for now. That way we can see the empty slots. So if we go to our widgets, inventory widget, W inventory slot, what you'll do is you'll just select the item icon, scroll down to visibility, set that to hidden, top damage, text, top text, set this also, set the visibility to hidden, bottom text, set that to hidden as well, select the item HP and set the visibility to hidden as well, and then the last thing, this quantity text, set that visibility to hidden. Compile and save that. Now if we hit play, we should see an empty inventory. So we have all of our empty slots in here, and technically you could add some more slots if you wanted to. So just to see what more slots would look like, if we were to go into our inventory here and add, say, 60 total slots, compile and save that, hit play, you can see we have this little scroll bar, and we can now scroll through our little inventory. So the scroll bar will be added if you have, more than a certain amount of slots. So if the inventory expands all the way down to here. So I'm just going to leave this back to 30. But if you want to play around with that and change the inventory, the amount of slots that you have, you can always do that. Just make sure you change the component inventory and add more slots. Okay, so that's it for the items container grid. So we've created the container grid and we've added it to our inventory. So we now have the visuals for our inventory slots. So this means we can now start working on adding in the functionality so that when we add an item to our inventory, it will update the slot icon inside of our inventory. So with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next lecture where we will work on adding in the item slot functionality.